Jesus Armas, a former intern of the Institute of Economic Affairs and a graduate of the University of Bristol, is missing in Venezuela. Jesus is a prominent opposition figure in Venezuela, a human rights activist, and a campaigner for freedom and democracy. He was taken by 6 masked agents at around 9 p.m. on December the 10th, 2024, and arbitrarily detained. It is believed that Jesus is being held at a well-known torture prison in Caracas under the custody of Venezuela's political police. Nicolas Maduro was defeated in the Venezuelan election in July, but instead of accepting the result, Maduro has resorted to state terrorism to hold on to power and silence any voices who stand up for democracy and point out the truth. Jesus has written from hiding about the repression faced by opposition campaigns in Venezuela, including the imprisonment of campaigners and shutting down of establishments such as hotels and restaurants that served them. He is just one of over 2,000 victims being arbitrarily detained. He worked with us at the IEA as an intern in 2020 and is remembered very fondly by everyone who worked alongside him. He wanted to come to the IEA because it was, as far as he was concerned, the home of the liberty movement. During that time, we learnt much from him. He spoke on the IEA YouTube channel about what was happening in Venezuela, previously hailed as being a socialist utopia by many. It has long been a despotic regime in reality. Jesus said, "The democratic willed solidarity is essential to reclaiming Venezuela's freedom. We have written to the British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, and the embassy in Venezuela to make representations to the Venezuelan authorities for the immediate release of Jesus and others like him who have been arbitrarily detained. We await a reply from the Foreign Office and news from Venezuela. In the meantime, our thoughts remain with Jesus' friends and family and all of those who are suffering under Maduro's regime."
The good thing about it is that means you no longer have a Soviet-type system where a bunch of bureaucrats in Whitehall are trying to work out housing needs, but where they look at market signals and say, well, these signals are clearly telling us something.
If you're growing at a rate of 2% a year, that means every 35 years, living standards double. If you're growing at 0.5%, it means it takes about 140 years. You had privatised profits and when it all went south, the government picked up the tab.
Hello and welcome to the IEA Podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications at the IEA. Today I'm joined by our Editorial Director Christian Niemitz and our Managing Editor Daniel Freeman. On the IEA Podcast we try to get underneath the bonnet of the week's headlines and into the issues that matter to classical liberals, and there's plenty to get on today, not least our usual topics of economic growth and government spending. But first, this week the new Housing Secretary Angela Rayner has announced some planning reforms. Now, this is obviously a topic key to our aims and passions here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Just recently, Christian Niemitz here wrote a booklet called Home Win, which set out what a successful housing policy might have looked like from a hypothetical time 10 years in the future. Christian, can you walk us through that and tell us what you thought might happen at this time in the actual calendar, December 2024?
Yeah, so this publication came out in March this year, and so far it is pretty much going according to plan. So maybe the conspiracy theories really are true, and Britain really is secretly controlled behind the scenes from Tufton Street. So in this, from when I wrote it, Hypothetical Future, there was a passage where I'm saying in December 2024, the new Housing Secretary announced the first tangible policy changes, blah, 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 and then a reintroduction of mandatory housing targets and a ramping up of the numbers. And then goes on to describe how there is a NIMBY backlash, like every time before, when governments try to do something about the housing crisis. But that this time something was different, which is that on all the previous occasions, the NIMBYs were pretty much unopposed. So you had the NIMBY backlash and nothing standing in their way, really. You had one or two reformers and they were isolated, and the whole party would then turn against them. And in my hypothetical future, what is different is that there is such a thing as a YIMBY counter movement or a backlash against the backlash. You have the NIMBYs doing their usual thing, being against everything, but you also have the YIMBYs coming out of the woodworks and saying, no, wait, this is the right thing to do. We have a housing crisis, we have a supply shortfall, and we need to build stuff, and we cannot just keep blocking everything. And my hope is that it's going according to plan so far. My hope is that this will continue in that way, and that especially I mean, there is definitely a NIMBY backlash that's already forming from the usual suspects and also parts of the opposition in Parliament. My hope is simply that that this time they really will stick to their guns and say this won't be immediately popular, but this is the right thing to do, and we will just ignore the NIMBYs.
Brilliant. So we've predicted correctly so far. Can you just walk us through a little bit what Rayner has announced this week, why we should be maybe cautiously optimistic, even if it may not be far enough?
Yeah, so the Labour Party, so far, they've been using this term, what they call the grey belt. And so far, the grey belt wasn't an actual thing. It was simply their way of saying a lot of green belt land isn't literally green. That was just their way of getting that message across. It now looks as if grey belt is going to become an actual planning designation. So something that is encoded in the planning laws where you will they will selectively remove green belt protections from parts of the green belt that so they will have to come up with a precise definition of what exactly they mean by grey belt. It will mostly, I guess, mean previously developed land. So something like disused car parks on the green belt. And they will just trim it back in that way. And that's a good thing because the green belt, I think the whole name is a complete scam. Much of it isn't green. And I would just rename the whole thing completely. I'd give it a more honest name. But okay, they're starting in this way. And it is now it's no longer just rhetoric. It is now an actual change in how the planning system works. And then there is a redrawing of the housing target numbers. So I think the total numbers are not going to change massively, but they will calculate them in a different way, in a way where they base it on actual house prices. And that just means that the targets will rise for London and the Southeast especially. That was the mistake that they previously made, where they had some algorithm which came up with new housing target numbers where they just said we will have, for some reason, lower targets in the places where the crisis is worst. And it looks like they're now addressing this. They're basing it on market prices rather than some random algorithm. And the good thing about it is that means you no longer have a Soviet-type system where a bunch of bureaucrats in Whitehall are trying to work out housing needs, but where they look at market signals and say, well, these signals are clearly telling us something.
So we've got a redrawing of the green belt with something that the think tanks like us have been arguing for a long time, that the green belt isn't all lovely Cotswolds area, there are some derelict car parks, and a rebranding of that. And we've got a change in the housing target system to incorporate the price mechanism. This is excellent for classical liberals and people that believe in the power of markets. Were you surprised that Angela Rayner was the one who brought this forward?
Well, on some levels, yes, but on some levels, we probably shouldn't have been. The Labour Party did make a central part of their message going into the July elections that they were going to get houses built. And you do have this tension within the Labour Party in that there's a certain element that is suspicious of the private sector, suspicious of developers, very keen on sort of environmental protections and sort of regulations. They have less of a sort of innate sort of hostility to that than you might get from some on the right, at least. But then you've also got the element that is, a lot of Labour MPs are representing urban constituencies. A lot of their voters are young people who might be earning decent wages, but are finding it really, really difficult to get onto the housing ladder. And those people are a really big constituency for the Labour Party. And they're just not for the Conservative Party. In the same way that, the Labour Party often tends to look out for the interests of public sector workers, the Conservative Party tends to look out for the interests of asset-rich pensioners because they are their biggest constituency. And you've got a certain tension there that even though many in the Conservative Party over the last 10, 15 years have sort of said, yeah, we're really committed to, the free market and really committed to, deregulation and that sort of things. When it comes to the planning system and the housing market, that butts up against, noisy constituents of people who already overwhelmingly own their own homes and so aren't particularly interested in this as a topic.
So maybe there is hope for the NIMBY Alliance to come forward.
Yeah, one small addition to that. When I wrote this, I'm talking about a hypothetical future housing secretary. So I wasn't picturing Angela Rayner when I wrote this. I think the person I described is not inspired by any real person. I was, I guess, making up an idealized version of a housing secretary. But I think I was saying it is somebody.
You did send her a copy.
I did, yeah.
And she wrote back.
Yeah, she received it, yeah.
So I'm sure she read every single page, and that's what it is.
I'm absolutely certain about that.
Yeah.
What else would explain what's happening now? But the housing secretary that I'm describing was a solid NIMBY to begin with, but then gets further radicalized by the NIMBY opposition and then realizes I have to double down, I have to become even more of a NIMBY than I already am. And if Angela Rayner now has a radicalization experience of that kind, all the better.
We're on to a winner. So how optimistic are we that the changes that they brought forward this month will do the trick? Will they help us get growth back? Will they help people get on the housing ladder?
Depends really on how far they go. So a lot of it will be, how large is this grey belt going to be? Where is it going to be? And then with the housing target numbers, one problem with that is that as long as you rely exclusively on or predominantly on target numbers, you need the political will. You need a government that has the political will to keep going and to keep telling NIMBY councils, no, you have to approve higher numbers. The current government seems to have that willingness so far, and that's why in here I try to make clear it shouldn't stay that way for long. This is a first step. You then have to move to a settlement where house building becomes self-accelerating and where the government of the day is no longer that important, where they can take a step back and let the system just work for itself rather than there being a need for them to be constantly putting pressure on NIMBY councils to go against their instincts.
And how might you do that? How does it become self-accelerating?
Well, part of it is in the final phases, they completely change the tax system so that councils or local authorities that are actively NIMBY deprive themselves of tax revenue and they won't get a bailout. They will make themselves poorer if they insist on being NIMBYs, whereas the ones that are more permissive realize the benefits and they just become a lot better off in fiscal terms, and by just permanently redrawing a lot of greenbelt land, and that's something that can be done on a one-off basis. Once you've removed that special designation, then you have a new settlement where that special protection no longer applies, and at some stage they also move to a planning system, in my version of events, where you take the discretionary element out of it. So that's one of the problems here. It's not just that you need a permit to build, but also that permission can be withheld on an arbitrary basis. And we don't do this in other areas of life where you need a permit. Say if you compare this to driving licenses, you can say, okay, that's a permit system. You can't just drive a car because you feel like it. But it's a very rules-based one. If you can show that you know how to drive a car and that you know the traffic rules, it's not that they're going to ask your neighbors, should this person have a car or should this person be allowed? Or do you think there are enough cars already in your neighborhood? It doesn't matter what your neighbors think. They don't have the power to stop you. And that's also the way in which I would organize housing. If your neighbors think you shouldn't have a right to build, well, they should mind their own business.
Yeah. Although that is one of the kind of grounds for pessimism about just how far the current government are willing to go with this, in that there has been briefing that they're not going to go down a sort of route of reforming the planning system wholesale by moving to a zoning system, for example, basically because they say, oh, this will be really complicated and disruptive. Well, I mean, yeah, But I think that's basically what you're ultimately going to need to move to if you want to seriously resolve this as both a political issue and an ongoing economic issue. Because otherwise, a lot of the measures that they're proposing are good, but they're good in the same way that giving someone paracetamol when they've got cancer is good. It's like it's making things a bit better, but it's not actually going to resolve the fundamental problem.
Yeah, at some point they will have to think about how do we bake these reforms in so that they are here to stay, so that when there's a new government and they don't share our sympathies, how to make it harder for them to reverse this completely.
Well, yeah, like a good version of the Town and Country Planning Act, which did exactly this. You got you got a new piece of legislation passed by Attlee's government in 1947, and with some tweaks, that has basically remained in place for the last 80 years, despite what the vast majority of economists now acknowledge are really, really bad distortions that it creates in the economy.
Yeah, you could also compare it to the trade union reforms in the Thatcher years, in the sense that was something which a Labour government wouldn't have done on their own. But once it was done, they were able to say, okay, this is what we inherited. We're going to work with it. We're not going to completely reverse it.
And I think policies working and actually producing, better living standards and higher levels of growth are actually a really good way of baking a policy in. You don't, in our political system and constitution, you can't really formally bake things in. Anything can be revised by an act of parliament. But generally, opposition parties will be less likely to try and replace something if it works. Yeah. And I think abundance of housing will work if you give it the chance.
So, reason for optimism, if not the whole solution yet, but a step in the right direction by all means. And we've touched upon now, which I'd like to move on to, the effects of housing and planning and fixing that problem on economic growth. Today we've had stats out for the growth rate in October, and the economy shrunk a tiny bit, unexpectedly so. This is following the Chancellor's budget at the end of October. So this is preceding the budget in October, actually, as people were, it's largely being put down to sort of the economy of businesses holding off to wait to see what happened in the budget. So people are therefore not optimistic about the next month's GDP stats, where the budget was largely bad news for business. But just to take a bit of a step back, we had a speech delivered by US economist Tyler Goodspeed earlier this week at the IEA, at the Ralph Harris Centenary Lecture. And he posed a question, or tried to answer the question, rather, of how to get the UK growing again. And we here at the IEA talk about things very often, like planning, like labour markets, like energy, for example. But Tyler agreed with those things, but had a slightly different take as well. Dan, you want to take us through that?
I mean, I really enjoyed that lecture. I found it really informative and interesting. I mean, on one level, it's very depressing because so he outlines how basically, because he's an economic historian by training, he outlined the kind of history of growth in Britain since the 1950s. So what you tend to see between the 1950s and 2008, when we had the global financial crisis, the UK has trend growth in per capita terms of about 2.5% each year. And it rises pretty steadily. Like sometimes you get recessions. So, in the mid 1970s, you get a big recession following the oil shock. But then you get booms. And basically over the decades, growth follows this trend. And Britain is actually growing over this period at basically the same rate as the United States. In fact, probably slightly more quickly, even though we're starting from being poorer than them. But then in 2008, you see a massive break. So you get the recession. And, that, we get negative growth for a year or two. That recovers. But then after that, productivity growth and just growth in GDP per capita doesn't return to trend. We see a new trend over the last 15 to 20 years that's much, much lower. So now we're seeing growth at about 0.5% per year in per capita terms. And right, you on one level, sometimes people say, oh, well, what's the difference, 2% or 0.5% growth? Well, in practical terms, this compounds. So if you're growing at a rate of 2% a year, that means every 35 years, living standards double, roughly. If you're growing at 0.5%, which we are currently, it means it takes about 140 years for living standards to double. And the thing is, this isn't something that is happening across the world, because in the United States, they have pretty much returned to trend. I mean, they did take a hit during the recession, but have got it back up. And so Tyler Goodspeed was basically going through the reasons, like, why is this happening? And we have, he outlined some of the issues that we've been talking about. He has our, sclerotic planning system. He mentioned energy. He mentioned, a range of standard things, over-regulation, certain like very high marginal tax rates. But the thing is, one of the things he pushed back on a bit is, I think, this idea of the housing theory of everything, that everything comes down to planning. Because he points out that, like, the planning system didn't suddenly get 5 times worse in 2008. It did, that had existed for decades and decades. Now, the Greenbelt had expanded, but that wasn't something new in 2008. So what he was trying to do was, okay, what is new since 2008? And the main thing he focused on is credit. So credit for non-financial businesses particularly. So, one of the causes, or the causes that people sort of ascribed to the financial crisis in 2008, was banks taking too much risk, lending out too much money that they shouldn't have. And so a lot of financial reforms were imposed after 2008, basically saying that if you're a bank, you have to if you're a big bank, you have to go through lots of stress testing, and you have to have, higher capital requirements, which means banks have to put more money into really, really safe assets like government bonds. It also means that the less appealing side of it is that it means they're less likely to be lending out to new businesses, because new businesses, almost by definition, are risky. And so he just, he put up on the screen an incredibly depressing graph where it's basically UK bank lending to non-financial businesses since the 1990s. And it's all in real terms, so inflation is accounted for. And it goes up and up and up until about 2008. Then it crashes for a bit. Then it slowly sort of goes back up, but then it stagnates. So today, 15 years after the original credit crunch, banks are lending about as much money to non-financial business as they were back then. And this creates a lot of problems, because if firms cannot borrow money, it means can't borrow, the amount of money they need to, like, invest in new machinery or training or whatever, or expand their workforce. It's really, really difficult to get productivity up. So this is the sort of thing he fixed on. And he makes a point that this is not just an issue in Britain. It's an issue across a lot of European countries, in large part because of the way our banking systems are set up. In most European countries, you have a small number of big banks who deal with, most lending. And because they're big, they have a lot of regulatory requirements, because governments are very worried that they don't want them to have to bail them out again. Whereas what's different about the United States is that you have just a huge number of smaller, more local banks. So he was pointing out, in the US, you have 5,000 banks that lend to business across the country. In Britain, on paper, it's like 250, but I would imagine that like 10 of those will account for the vast majority of that. And so in the US, because you have lots of these smaller banks, they're not burdened with all this, stress testing and stuff. Which means that they're more able to lend to business, and you also have more, venture capital on that side of things. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was a really interesting perspective. I wouldn't, I think he probably underplayed the effect of rising energy prices. So industrial electricity is now like 3 times more expensive in real terms than it was 3.5 times more expensive than it was in 2004. And that's not, it was already like that before the war in Ukraine, and now it's just got worse. So he didn't really focus on that, but I thought it was a really interesting perspective.
It is fascinating. Christian, what's your view? You are a very vocal proponent of the argument that planning and housing, well, not housing specifically, but planning in the broader sense is really the biggest problem we have. So what do you make of the argument that Daniel's just laid out from Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, Tyler didn't disagree with any of that. It's just that he said his initial thesis was precisely that, the issue that the standard NIMBY thesis that we've often mentioned on this podcast and in other publications, that our inability to build things, whether that's business premises, infrastructure, power generation and so forth, that is the biggest drag on growth. He said he started with that thesis and he never renounced it. He never said, I now believe the opposite and I believe that's wrong. It's just that he started thinking more about why is there this sudden structural break in the data? Because if the standard NIMBY hypothesis was the only thing you need to know, what you would expect is a gradual worsening over time as these NIMBY constraints become more and more binding and develop more and more of a bite. But you wouldn't expect to see any particular year where you would see, even if you know nothing about, in his case, if you showed his graphs in a blind test, so you don't know what it means, you would still be able to identify, oh, there's a break here. This specific point, you get a growth rate of at one level before and a lower level after that. And that structural break, that is something which the housing theory of everything, NIMBY thesis alone cannot explain. And I remember I had that problem once. I was doing an interview somewhere where I explained the low growth of the past 15 years in our usual terms. And the interviewer asked me, okay, but why specifically this break? None of these problems are new, and they may have gotten gradually worse over time, but not in the sense that there's a massive difference between the year 2012 and the year 2007. And I said, yeah, I can't really explain that. It's okay. It could be. You could imagine lots of reasons why there is something bad going on and it's just concealed for a while. But even then, you would still have to explain, okay, what exactly is concealing it and what would have happened without these concealing measures before then. And that's where his Tyler's take is an original one. That's where he goes over and above what, regular listeners will have heard before, and where, okay, I guess sometimes we're a bit sorry that we keep banging on about this. It's just that it's true, and you keep coming back to it even if you don't want to. But yes, there are other things over and above that going on as well.
Yeah, I think I should have perhaps made more clear. Tyler really wasn't saying that planning doesn't matter or it is not a serious constraint on growth. It's just, yeah, it's not something that has emerged since 2008. And I don't know, maybe the lesson in this is that you can actually get a lot of policy wrong and still have okay levels of growth if you get a few other things right. So, people bring up the example of like France has had pretty similar levels of growth to the UK over the last sort of 10 years, despite having like incredibly restricted labour laws. But on the other hand, it gets some things right. So it has relatively cheap electricity produced by its, massive network of nuclear power stations. It also has pretty good infrastructure that it can build much, much cheaper than we can.
Yeah, the road network is more than twice as long as here for an almost identical population.
Yeah, and maybe that's, the UK in the early 2000s. Or in the 1990s, you can have these problems with planning that are becoming more and more acute in the late 90s and early 2000s because the population is increasing because of immigration. But at the same time, if you have a really booming financial sector, if you have banks that are willing to lend to businesses to expand, and you have really quite cheap energy, which people forget, we did have cheap energy in the early 2000s. This starts to change after about 2005. You can get away with a lot of really bad policy. It's like, the US, California still manages to, have a massive tech sector, despite most of these areas being, heavily NIMBY-ish and having a huge load of other problems, really expensive infrastructure, that sort of thing. But if you just get enough right, you can get away with it.
Yeah, we see this in individual sectors as well, where, say, aviation, so the congestion problems in the big airports, Heathrow, Gatwick, that's not new. There were government white papers from, I think, 2003, 2004, warning about this already. But you still had, for a long time, massive growth in passenger numbers, where they just did manage to, firstly, use bigger planes, but also just to squeeze more planes into a given runway and a given takeoff slot, where for a while it would have been possible to say, well, it doesn't really matter. The sector is still growing, but at some point, these constraints that are already lurking in the background do start to bite.
So what do we? So we talk a lot of, as we've mentioned, about the solutions we think there are to the planning system and to those elements, and it may be a bigger question than to be answered right this second. But thinking about the banking regulation point and the crunching credit, what do we do about that? Where do the answers come from there? I expect deregulation as a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but then there's also this sort of tension that has been in the minds of sort of policymakers since the global financial crisis, that like we don't want to be on the hook for if banks do start making sort of more risky investments and it all goes south, we don't want to be on the hook for that. And there was a legitimate criticism of the bank bailouts and the system in the run up to that you had kind of privatized profits, and when it all went south, the government picked up the tab. So you want to be able to avoid that. Like America is able to do that to a significant extent by just having lots of relatively small banks. But yeah, I mean, Andrew Lillico has written a bit about this idea of having sort of safe banking, because his slightly controversial idea, I hope I'm not sort of mangling it or simplifying it too much, is that it's a problem that more banks aren't allowed to go under. That basically because there's a perception among the public that if you put money in a bank, it's totally safe. Mm-hmm. It means the government is essentially forced to bail it out if one does collapse, which encourages inappropriate risk taking, and then you have to correct with regulation, which distorts things in bad ways and sort of causes problems. His suggestion is basically that you set up two different options for bank accounts. One which is like safe banking, where it's like they only invest in sort of like government bonds or things that are like really, really safe unless there's a nuclear war or something like that. And those ones you can be like, okay, you'll get like very low interest rates, but my money is safe in there. And then you'll have a risky option, which is like, it actually lends to business. And there is a possibility that if they make loads of bad investments, it will go under and you will lose some or all of your money. But because you have chosen that option, there will be less political pressure to bail out those kind of banks rather than the sort of safe banking route.
It's a concept we're quite familiar with in general savings accounts and that sort of thing. But then I guess that's between putting your money in a savings account or sort of investing it in shares ISA, for example. Now, just to move on to our last topic before we run out of time. Once again, the government is talking about making efficiency savings as it does intermittently. This week, the Chancellor has kicked off the spending review, saying that departments are going to need to find 5% efficiency savings, not from frontline services, which is an absolute classic. And it's actually, I think, a reform policy from their manifesto this year, which is an interesting adoption. Christian, we spoke about this on this podcast before, actually, with reference to Mises. Are we confident that finding 5% efficiency savings is going to, A, be possible, B, touch the sides, C, have any effect?
Yeah, the trouble with that is you would have to be able to identify where the inefficiencies are. And that's hard to do in a public sector organization where you have no obvious metrics. And there is one of the public choice economists, must have been Gordon Tullock, talks about examples where that has happened in the past, mostly in America, elsewhere probably as well, where governments try to impose efficiency savings of that sort on public sector organizations. And what they often do is they deliberately cut those parts of their budget where they know the public will notice in order to create a backlash against it. Because they want to boycott the plans, so they don't want to make any savings of that kind.
Yeah.
And if you can't identify from the outside, you can say, okay, surely this organization must have some fat reserves, but as an outside observer, you can't say where they are. And if the organization itself has no incentive to come up with them, then you have a problem.
Yeah, I sometimes suspect the BBC also do that. Whenever the government is sort of threatening not to increase the license fee, they tend to announce that, oh, well, we're going to have to get rid of the BBC Recipes website because everyone finds it really convenient. And even people who don't have a TV or don't watch it are like, oh, yeah, I use that. And it's good.
Also quite implausible that will be the driver of costs.
Well, yeah, I don't imagine that's the sort of main top area of expense. But
this comes back to, again, what we were saying earlier, that the government, in previous podcasts, that if the government wants to make savings, it needs to work out what it needs to do and what it shouldn't be doing. And it's also interesting, actually, the juxtaposition between what the government is doing and saying during the budget, which is we're going to plough lots more money into these vastly underfunded departments. The Tories have let them rot for 14 years. We're going to come in and sort of do capital investment, invest in the public sector properly, spend loads of money in there. And now they're saying, actually, there's loads of waste in these places, so we need to chop.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, the 2 points could be coherent. I mean, I think there has been a general acknowledgement that, for example, the size of the civil service has grown a lot in terms of raw numbers, and that needs to come down. So if you go back to 2016, the civil service was under 400,000 people, having been cut down from about 500,000 in 2010. After 2016, in part because you had to hire a load of civil servants to respond to the requirements of Brexit, but also the big increases during the COVID pandemic. The number of civil servants has now gone up to 510,000. And so the previous government was saying, right, we're going to cut this back down to 420,000, the level it was pre-pandemic. When Labour came in, they said, oh, we're not going to do that. We're not going to have these arbitrary headcount figures. But since then, they've announced, yeah, we are actually going to have to cut it back by about 10,000 people. So not getting us back down to anywhere near we were in 2019, but cutting it down a bit. And I guess the question is, how exactly is that 10,000 going to be found? Because there is one possibility that it's just through natural wastage, like people leave and aren't replaced. And that probably wouldn't be a particularly efficient way to go about it, because if your idea is we need to boost productivity, well, that does involve like finding the areas where there are problems, or areas where we should be like, right, this isn't something we should be dealing with, and cutting that back, rather than just sort of, taking a few dozen people out of that department, a few dozen out of it.
Yeah, but I also think it's the wrong focus overall. If you want to make actual savings in government spending, it's not the Whitehall machinery itself, which is the big cost driver. It's the big entitlement programs, and that's what you have to work on. But there, of course, you'll make some enemies.
Yeah, it's not quite as politically appealing as cutting Whitehall officials, is it?
Well, no, okay, because we think this has nothing to do with us. We don't see a direct impact.
As Jeremy Clarkson put it during the farmer debate, walking down Whitehall saying we can find the money by walking into any of these buildings, asking somebody what they do, and if you don't understand the answer, then fire them.
Yeah, I think that's not really the case, obviously.
No, but potentially done.
But I would agree that overall, obviously, the vast majority of government spending is not pampered civil servants or anything like that. But that doesn't mean there aren't like serious problems with the civil service, the way it's organized, which can also lead to ballooning expenses in other areas because of the way it's structured. And like, if you talk to civil servants, like, they are very happy to acknowledge that there are serious problems. One of them being, everyone will tell you it is really, really difficult to sack underperformers. And what you tend to get is people who are not performing well in one team.
Mm-hmm. They get promoted to a different team.
Well, yeah, best case scenario, they get shuffled sideways to somewhere else, and so there's someone else's problem. Or, yeah, they get promoted out. You also, I think, have a serious problem developing over the last 15 years of kind of pay compression, because what you've seen is people on the very bottom end of the civil service salary, their pay is basically kept up with inflation. But senior civil servants have seen cuts since 2010 of about 20% in real terms. And so what you also tend to see is that people, a lot of people who are really good at their job, who might be very good in a more senior role, will basically think, do I want to take a role that is way, way more stressful, involves a huge amount of responsibility, and, I'm going to be getting an extra £10,000 or something, most of which or half of which is going to be eaten up by my student loan and my by taxation as well. So a lot just won't bother. And so you do have this, people either moving out into the private sector, or just sort of staying at more junior levels than they might all otherwise be in.
That's a really interesting point, and it speaks to another thing that the government is trying to do something about in some way, which is the draw of these big civil service jobs. I mean, these are serious jobs; they are literally running the country, but the pay just doesn't really match up to the sort of skills that you would want, to what those sorts of people could go and get in the private sector. So the government's trying to put spending plans in front of private sector experts and things like that. But ultimately, there's this weird juxtaposition where, yes, we all agree that the civil service could be sort of increased. It could increase its efficiency in some ways, but at the same time saying, well, we do potentially need to pay senior civil servants, or those ones in the really crucial departments, a little bit more money to attract the best talent.
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue with a politicized service, though, that, of course, that is going to be hard to justify, and then it will be easy for parts of the tabloid press to say, oh, look, here are the public sector fat cats. Yeah. And it's not like in a private sector organization where, okay, yeah, of course, we also get the left-wing press getting outraged about CEO pay. Before a private company, it wouldn't be much easier to say, yes, okay, this is a big number. We realize that. But look what happens to the share value after the appointment of that person, there clearly is a market expectation that appointment is going to make a difference and is going to pay for itself in that way. There is no public sector equivalent to that. So it goes back to the good old von Mises and the calculation problem within bureaucracies.
Which is a brilliant place to land if there ever was one. Thank you for joining us on the IEA podcast this week. If you want to hear more from us, then sign up to our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk and tune in next time for the next version of this podcast. Thank you.